Good evening, and welcome to this, the first lecture in the 2008-2009 series sponsored by the Religious and Psychological Well-Being Project of the Danielson Institute at Boston University. This project is funded by the Meta-Nexus Institute and is managed by the Danielson Institute's Center for the Study of Religion and Psychology, of which Dr. Brian McCorkle is the director. My name is Robert Neville, and I'm the director of the project. The core of the lecture series this year is a set of lectures to be given by Professor Don Browning of the University of Chicago on the topic Psychotherapy, Psychology, and Spirituality. These will be delivered at 4 and 7 p.m. on October 26th, at 7:30 on October 27th, and at 4 and 7:30 p.m. on November 16th and 7:30 on November 17th. Please remember all that and plan to attend. The lectures will be in room 101 of the Sargent College at 635 Commonwealth Avenue in Boston University. Tonight is the first of several guest lectures, and we're delighted to have as our speaker Professor Ann Harrington. Professor Harrington is professor and chair of the History of Science Department at Harvard University and visiting professor for the medical history at the London School of Economics. For the past 2 decades, Professor Harrington's work has focused on concepts of the relation between mind and body, shining a bright light on the diversity of socially, politically, and religiously motivated ideas that have competed for scientific high ground in this contested area of Western thought. For 6 years, she was the director, along with psychologist Jerome Kagan, of Harvard's Mind, Brain, and Behavior Initiative. She has also served as a consultant with the MacArthur Foundation Research Network on mind-body interactions. Professor Harrington has authored and edited several critically acclaimed volumes on topics such as the concept of the bicameral mind in 19th century Europe, holism in Weimar Germany, and the placebo effect in modern medicine. Her most recent book, The Cure Within, A History of Mind-Body Medicine, was released last month by W.W. Norton. In the last decade, Professor Harrington has lent her skills of historical and cultural analysis to emerging conversations between cognitive scientists and practitioners of Tibetan Buddhism. She now serves on the board of the Mind and Life Institute, an organization dedicated to the promotion of cross-cultural dialogue between Buddhism and Western science. And she's co-edited 2 volumes on the subject, Visions of Compassion in 2000 and The Dalai Lama at MIT in 2006. Join me in welcoming Professor Ann Harrington.
That was a very nice introduction. Thank you very much. So I will be talking a bit today about specifically this last strand of this sort of overview of the things I've been doing. My interest in the dialogue between cognitive science, neuroscience, and Buddhism. My involvement as a my involvement as someone who's engaged in trying to make these dialogues as good as they possibly can be, but also my perspective on these dialogues as an historian and, in a sense, a kind of cultural critic in the most constructive of ways of these. So I'll be weaving together a range of different kinds of disciplinary and modes and perspectives. And I want to start with a kind of a curtain raiser. There's an event that maybe some of you, if you're interested at all in this sort of Buddhism, brain science dialogue, at least heard of, and maybe more than heard of, maybe even a few of you were there. It happened in 2005 at the 2005 Society of Neuroscience meeting. The Dalai Lama came. Appeared in his signature saffron crimson robes and spoke to 13,000 neuroscientists who had crowded into an auditorium to hear from him. And here you see a sort of an image of the event. Now, he had been, there was a title, the title that had been given for his talk was The Neuroscience of Meditation. And there had been a prepared text that had been given to the press, and I had a chance to see the prepared text. But when it came time for him to speak to this huge crowd of neuroscience, he sort of set the text aside, and he talked about his curiosity about the world, his affection for science, his belief that science and Buddhism had a lot to say to each other and could say it constructively, the benefits that he hoped Buddhist meditation could bring for secular people, benefits of health, happiness. Now, this speech, have any of you heard of it? Were you aware of it? Was anyone there? Well, if you at least had heard of it, you know that this speech had been subjected to no little controversy prior to the Dalai Lama showing up. There had been, in fact, a petition that had circulated around the Society of Neuroscience saying this is absurd, religious figures speaking in front of scientists, this is bringing down the whole intellectual rigor and tenor of our society. The fact that a large number of those who were spearheading the petition were either Chinese or Chinese origin complicated the whole situation. But the upshot of it is that he came, he spoke, he said basically what I've told you he said, and at the end of this event, the scientists gave him a rousing standing ovation. And I'd like to invite us to be curious about this. In the sense of what is going on? What's the Dalai Lama doing at the Society of Neuroscience? Why was he deemed to have had any kind of authority in a context like this? What in the world does Tibetan Buddhism have to do with brain science? Now, if you've been interested in these things, or if you follow the immediate events around this particular talk of the Dalai Lama's, you might know there's an easy answer, a kind of an easy answer to this. The Dalai Lama was at the Society for Neuroscience in 2005 because he had been invited by the president at the very strong suggestion of this man, Richard Davidson, at the University of Wisconsin, known among colleagues and friends alike as Richie, someone that I also have known now for more than 15 years, but who I've watched over the past 2, 3, 4 years as he's become a bit of a celebrity in these circles, and also a bit of a controversial celebrity or scientist in these circles, feted in the media on the one side, but looked at by some of his colleagues on the other side, just a little bit anxiously, a little bit askance for the studies that he's been carrying out, specifically looking at the brain function of monks who practice advanced forms of meditation, who have practiced meditation for 20, 30 years in a very intensive way. All these studies carried out with the express blessing of the Dalai Lama, with whom he has a very real but also quite public and well-known personal friendship. And here you see the Dalai Lama visiting his lab and looking at someone in an fMRI machine and learning about what goes on in the lab. Incidentally, a year after the Dalai Lama appeared at the Society of Neuroscience at Davidson's recommendation, Davidson was named by Time magazine one of that year's most influential people, in no small part because of his role in facilitating the Buddhism neuroscience dialogue. Well, so what's Davidson doing? Why, what had he done that was persuasive enough to make it seem plausible to invite the Dalai Lama to the Society of Neuroscience? What had the research itself done to encourage the sense, or to create a sense, that there was something for the neuroscientific community to pay attention to? Okay, well, there are these studies of monks, and let me tell you the gist of what they seem to have shown, and then we'll see if we can say a little more about what you might want to make of it all. They boil down to a pretty clear and yet bold claim, namely that long-term meditation seems to have the effect of rewiring the brain in ways that might make you happier and maybe even healthier. The reason that people say this, the specific claims boil down to three things. The startle response, the startle response of monks to aversive stimuli like these images that have been shown to produce a kind of a aversive stress response in subjects. The startle response follows a different course in these advanced practitioners than it does in untrained subjects. They recover much more quickly from the stress. They also found that the prefrontal areas of the left hemispheres of the advanced practitioners was more intensively activated than in untrained subjects. And a high level of activation on the left prefrontal cortex is supposed to be associated with people, is usually associated with people who score high on traits for optimism and well-being. And most intriguingly, and this is what got most of the media attention, when the monks allowed themselves to be hooked up with electrodes, a bit like you see here, and then meditated specifically on compassion, their brain activation levels were off the map. They were unlike anything that the researchers had ever seen in healthy, normal subjects. They were the gamma waves, which are people believe to be high-level beta waves, so it's indicating a very high level of attentiveness, of alertness. Their gamma waves were 30 times as strong as the student control group. And they were generated across the entire brain in a way that led one of the researchers involved in this study to suggest that maybe these monks were experiencing, in fact, a more integrated and intensive form of consciousness than normal people. And here you see Antoine Lutz, this other researcher that I'm talking about, comparing the brains of these monks, the wave activity over the brains of these monks to a jazz band in which in which the gamma waves come together to create a kind of higher level synthesis. These are the findings, and but the bottom line interpretation that gets picked up in the media translated itself into newspaper articles with titles like, "Are Buddhists happier? Is Buddhism good for your health?" New York Times, both articles, those titles were from the New York Times, both those articles. All right, so those are the immediate catalysts: exciting research, a prominent scientist, an invitation to his partner from the Tibetan Buddhist side to come to the Society of Neuroscience. That's the kind of the easy answer, what the Dalai Lama was doing at the Society of Neuroscience in 2005. But I'd like to probe a little bit more deeply with you tonight into some of the less obvious forces that went into the making of this particular project and the making of this larger idea that Tibetan Buddhism and brain science, of course, obviously, inevitably have something to say to one another. We do believe there's a kind of a hot partnership going on between Buddhism and the brain sciences now, and we do believe, some of us, I think, that it's not just any old partnership. It's a partnership that feels distinctly different. It feels more exotic, it feels more spiritual, it feels more enchanting in some almost quite literal sense from the many other kinds of partnerships that the neurosciences, after all, are striking up partnerships with humanistic disciplines all over the place these days. But this one feels different. Not so much because neuroscientists are asking bold questions about brain function, because in domains that previously they hadn't asked questions about, because Neuroscientists are asking questions about the neuroscience of morality these days. They're asking questions about the neuroscience of religious experience. They're asking questions about the neuroscience of economic decision-making. We've got a whole lot of things going on out there. You'll have seen some of these books or be familiar with these. We've got a lot of incursions by the neuroscientists into domains where they had previously feared to tread. This could feel like just more of the same, but it doesn't. Why not? I'm going to skip. I was just wanted to say here that the kind of way in which some of these other kinds of projects tend to be identified with a kind of very familiar sense that they're neurologizing us bit by bit, that we believe that the effect of finding the moral sense in our brain, or finding the God spot in our brain, or finding that part of our prefrontal cortex that clicks into action when we make a decision to sell a stock or not to sell a stock, has the effect of saying, sorry, your soul just died. It's just your brain after all. And this one feels different. Why? Well, I'm an historian, so the way that I help myself to understand what's going on in the present day usually is by trying to go back and see how things came to be and what non-obvious kinds of forces might have played into or helped create the way in which things come to be. So I'd like to do that a bit with you today and see what we might learn. And I'd like to start by talking about meditation and reminding ourselves how we here in the United States all first got interested in it. Some of you, a lot of you actually, probably weren't around back then, but as it happens, we were just having a little chat before before I stood up here. I've forgotten your name. I'm sorry. Bob. Bob, can I call you Bob? And of course, with Bob about his own involvement in the 60s and 70s counterculture, the psychedelic culture, the drug culture, the culture that saw an interest in all things Eastern, and particularly, and also saw an interest in Eastern forms of meditation, but not because people were keen to know whether or not Eastern brains were happier or healthier than the brains of Western people, but because people believed that Eastern meditators had discovered a drug-free route to expansive, altered states of consciousness. In 1967, the New York Times did a quite amusing feature on the growth of Hindu ashrams in New York City and interviewed one young woman who really made the connection quite clear. I have a little quote from her. "I kept thinking that through the constant use of LSD, I'd return to the religious feeling I had with it the first time, but it never came. And then I met Swami. I gave up drugs, I was hooked on religion and on yoga. I'm a better person now. I'm not hung up on myself anymore." Now, she says this, then they go on and they interview her teacher. This is what he has to say. In his view, these young people are just coming to the ashram to get a kind of drug-free route to cool experiences. They're exhibitionists. They have no discipline. What are they really learning about Hinduism? You can just hear him kind of grumbling away. This trend towards a drug culture, he says, is very dangerous. Now, I think the point about young people and discipline is actually quite important for our purposes because it can help us begin to understand what happens next. Does anyone know? How about if I give a visual cue? There's a generational thing going on here, too. There's a kind of nodding going on over there. The Maharishi Mahesh Yogi arrives from India to the United States first in 1959, offering a very simple, easy-to-learn alternative to the kinds of intensive practice of yoga and meditation that the young people were being offered in the ashrams. 20 minutes a day, twice a day, reciting a special mantra allegedly customized to your specific spiritual needs, 15, 20 minutes a day, and amazing changes, transformations were promised. Your mind would become more peaceful, more intelligent, more creative. Later on, they began to even suggest that if you kept practicing, you might develop certain kinds of paranormal abilities. And if you go onto the website of the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi's school of transcendental meditation, you still might see some of these photographs of people who allegedly could levitate as a consequence of the practice. Just out of curiosity, did you ever get involved in this?
I met him once.
You met the Maharishi?
I didn't believe it.
No. Now, all this, there was a lot of things being offered to the counterculture youth in these years, and the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi's transcendental meditation might have just remained a relatively minor sort of part of the larger marketplace of Eastern offerings had it not been for this. All right, look, we've got to, all right, how far does this generational gap go? Everybody knows who these guys are, right? Right? All right, so I don't need to, you know that band? You've heard of it? The Beatles met the Maharishi in the 1960s, and they decided he was going to be their guru, their teacher. And this had the effect of just whooshing open the whole world of TM. Joe Namath, the big football star of that era, became a celebrity. Mia Farrow became a follower. Became a follower. Mia Farrow became a follower. The Maharishi became a cult figure. The New York Times in 1969 called him the chief guru of the Western world, and they couldn't keep up with the numbers of people who wanted to learn TM. But here's the important point, at least for my purposes. None of this had anything to do with brain science. It didn't really have much to do with health, although they were prepared to throw in health too as one of the benefits, because they were claiming all sorts of wonderful benefits for TM. But it wasn't seen as health. There wasn't a big focus on stress, or on many, if not all, of the things that we associate with the serious study of meditation today. The Beatles were not meditating in order to improve their health. They were meditating in order to become more creative, to expand their consciousness. No one was studying the physiology of TM at the time, although, there we go, I should remember, there you go. There you see the article from 1967, the chief guru of the Western world. There you see some of the folks who were doing it back then. So no one was studying the physiology of meditation at that time, but there was interest in how far the state of mind associated with transcendental meditation might be explicable as some sort of strange quantum effect. This was also an era in which you see the first kinds of claims that somehow quantum physics, one very weird thing and mysterious thing and hard to understand thing, might have something to do with meditative states, another mysterious and inexplicable thing. Then in 1969, a graduate student. Sometimes graduate students are key to important historical events. Any graduate students here? Most of you undergraduates? Well, so you have time to become important. A graduate student at the University of California in Los Angeles named Robert Keith Wallace decided he was going to research the physiological effects of transcendental meditation for his dissertation. And he took a group of college students, like you, who had taken a course in TM, which were readily available on college campuses. He hooked them up to various measuring instruments, and he asked them to meditate. And he found that on average, they showed significant changes, reductions in their oxygen consumption, reductions in their resting heart rate, changes in skin resistance, but most significantly, from Wallace's perspective, they showed significant changes, he thought, in their brain waves. Their EEG results, Wallace thought, showed a highly coherent pattern of brain waves that had never been seen, he claimed, in the scientific literature before. Now, the Maharishi and the TM people had long claimed that TM produced a unique state of consciousness that was unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. Here, Wallace seemed to be offering neurophysiological evidence in support of this very important, for the purposes of marketing TM, very important claim. He publishes the results. Guess where? Where would you think this would get published? Sort of the Journal of Counterculture. Yeah, I'm not going to get you to interact with me, really. You're going to be on. Where do you think?
Rolling Stone.
In the Rolling Stone. Good guess. Good guess, too. Let me tell you, Science. The flagship journal of, the most sober, mainstream, it's published in Science. It's called, he denounces it as a discovery of the fourth major state of consciousness. And here's a quote from the article. Physiologically, the state produced by transcendental meditation seems to be distinct from commonly encountered states of consciousness, wakefulness, sleep, dreaming, and from altered states of consciousness, such as hypnosis and autosuggestion. We've got something we've never seen before from the brain waves. Now, I'm making a little bit of a point of this because I'd like you to be thinking, well, wait, we just had this study coming out about the gamma waves, that they were of an order never like anything anyone had ever seen before. So it might seem we've got a kind of similar situation, but let me tell you what happens to it. And what happens to it because, above all, of this man, Herbert Benson, still around, still active at Harvard Medical School, a guy that I know quite well, but who at this point in time was in the early stages of his career and was interested in the possibility that stress might increase one's risk for heart disease. He's a cardiologist, and stress research was still a relatively new and controversial and exploratory area in medicine in this period, and he was wondering whether there was something to be explored here. So he'd been trying to he'd been investigating biofeedback methods as a way to try to reduce stress in his cardiology patients and in that way lower their blood pressure as a way of lowering an important risk factor that they might have for heart disease. And so he was working on all this, and he was doing experiments with monkeys and with patients, and then all of a sudden a group of TM practitioners show up and tell him that he should be working with them. Leave the monkeys, forget the fancy biofeedback machines. We can do what you're finding that patients can do with biofeedback machines, and we don't need machines. Through simple practices of TM, we can lower our blood pressure just like that. Now, Benson, look at him. He's no counterculture figure. He wasn't a counterculture figure then. He isn't one now. He had no real background in Eastern philosophies or any of these things. And he likes to tell the story about how he said, no, go away, and they kept persisting, and finally he agreed to study them, but only at night, and after insisting that they come up the back stairs so that no one would know that this was going on. And it started to get interesting. And then Wallace's paper appears in Science just as this is going on, and he invites Wallace to come from the University of California over to Harvard Medical School so they can work together. And Wallace agrees. And they design a new study in which subjects would be measured in two conditions. In the first condition, they would just sit quietly for 20 minutes. In the second condition, they would still sit quietly for 20 minutes, except they would also silently repeat their mantra. The only difference, and this is what happened. This is Benson's words. Astounding. Through the simple act of changing what they were thinking about while they were sitting quietly, they experienced the same kinds of decreases in metabolism, breathing rate, brainwave frequency that Wallace had found, with one important, really important difference. Benson did not believe that anything from the data suggested that there was some kind of an extraordinary, unique state of consciousness being experienced by these TM practitioners. What he thought is that the TM was making them very relaxed. and making them very relaxed in ways that would be potentially clinically significant for his purposes, that they were experiencing, he said, a systematic reversal of the stress response. And over time, he came to name this something that's become a kind of familiar term for people in the self-help industry and elsewhere. He called it the relaxation response. How many of you have heard of this? Some of you, but been a bestseller ever since it was published, this book, in 1975. But from the point of view of trying to understand how we got to where we are today, the key thing to know about the relaxation response culturally is that it was not only a medicalization of meditation, it was also a very deliberate effort to distance meditation from all of its kind of counterculture, enchanting, magical, mystical associations. So Wallace breaks with him over this, and he actually becomes president after he breaks with Benson of the new Maharishi International University. Here you see him at his inaugural address. So Wallace then goes his own way. The Maharishi becomes enraged by Benson's deliberate secularization of the relaxation of TM. Benson talks about the fact that he actually received death threats from the TM organization for a while. But that was his choice, and when the relaxation response is published in 1975, on the back cover of the original edition, you have endorsements from a dean at Harvard Business School, a general practitioner, and a stress researcher, but not a whisper of any kind of Eastern guru, a person from any ashram, let alone anyone from TM. You would hardly know that TM played any role in this story if you didn't know the backstory. So it was a deliberate moment of disenchantment of the entire effort. And what we now need to understand is how we got back to where we are today. So we're not in a disenchanted place in the dialogue, our cultural dialogue with meditation. Now, on the contrary, I started off by suggesting that this is an enterprise that seems filled with sort of spiritual, enchanting kinds of energies, and we need to understand how we got back there. And the way to find out is to now move to 1979, the year that the Dalai Lama of Tibet paid his first visit to the United States. What you need to know about that first visit, because it's so different from where we are now in our relationship as a country with the Dalai Lama, is that the visa to visit the United States had been granted to the Dalai Lama by the Carter administration very reluctantly after years of his being denied a visa to visit the U.S. And when he was granted the visa, so you can just see, I'm not going to read these, but you can see 1977, no, you can't come. He'd been saying for some time he wanted to visit the U.S., not granted a visa. Finally, in 1979, granted the visa, but on the condition that he come not as a political leader of Tibet, of the Tibetan government, or representative of the Tibetan government in exile. He must simply be coming as a religious leader on a spiritual visit. And the explanation for that, if you think about it for a little while, is probably pretty evident or obvious, although officially the U.S. government in the late 70s opposed the Chinese occupation of Tibet. It was also involved in these years in attempting to improve relations with China, and that had been open. China had been opened up in the first half of the 1970s by Nixon's famous visit to that country. They were now attempting to build on that, and any kind of overt gesture of outreach to the Dalai Lama public could have an effect of scuttling that relationship. So there must be no mention, no discussion. If the Dalai Lama came, he must make no mention ever of the Chinese occupation of Tibet or talk about anything politically sensitive. That was the condition. And when he came, he was as good as his word. Here you see some illustrations from various kinds of newspaper coverage of his visit. It was quite a long visit, several weeks. When anyone tried to bring up anything political, he would very deftly deflect the conversation in other directions. He was happy to talk about interreligious dialogue. He was happy to talk about ethics. But he was also interested in talking about science. Not because anyone had told him that this was a good, safe theme to talk about. He happened to have a strong personal interest in science that went back to his own boyhood. And so, for example, at a meeting of scholars held in Texas on this visit, he says to them, I'd like to listen to your experiences. I'd like to hear what's the latest research into relations between consciousness and matter and how they affect each other. Now, I wasn't at that particular meeting, I hope obviously, but it's clear from what the report about that meeting that the scholars in Texas really didn't have much to say to that theme. However, 2 weeks later, the Dalai Lama came to Harvard for a 3-day visit. And one of the people that he met there was none other than Herbert Benson, who had been carrying out his work on the relaxation response now for some years. Benson got an audience with the Dalai Lama and told him about his work on the relaxation response and what he thought these implications this had for casting light onto the physiology of meditation. And then he said he had a request of the Dalai Lama himself. He wanted to take his work on the physiology of meditation, he said, to the next stage. And he knew that there was an esoteric Tibetan meditative practice called Tummo meditation, or inner heat meditation, in which advanced practitioners are said to be able to so regulate their thermal production, even in very, very frigid temperatures, and without warm clothing, that they can cause, you can see sort of steam rising up off their bodies. If it's true that they can regulate their thermal production in this way, even in very cold temperatures, Benson said this might be of very important clinical interest to Western medicine. And would the Dalai Lama assist him, Benson said, in the task of persuading some appropriate advanced practitioners of Tummo medication to participate in some experiments? Now, as Benson always later would publicly recall the conversation, the Dalai Lama immediately responded, yes. So the way Benson talks about it in the published literature, he says, His Holiness agreed to help me. Now, it's true. But when you go into the archives, which Benson has very kindly, of the documents from that visit that are at Harvard Medical School Countway Library, and read through the notes, what you see is a slightly more complicated story that I think is very significant. You see that the Dalai Lama was originally inclined to say no, for very not understandable reasons. The monks did what they did for religious purposes. It was intensely private. It was hooking them up to various kinds of machines for the purposes of measurement would disturb their practice, and so on. But then he thought again, and he said, and this is recorded in the archives, still, our friends to the east might be impressed with a Western explanation of what we're doing. What's he talking about? The Chinese. In other words, right, this might impress the Chinese, who spent a lot of energy, and still do, trivializing all of Tibetan religious practices as empty superstition with no value. And it's at this point that he turned back to Benson and said he could do the studies. So in other words, the Dalai Lama was not allowed to be overtly political during this first trip to the United States, but he's not going to turn down an opportunity to assist the Tibetan cause and change the dynamic of Sino-Tibetan relations if one simply opens up for him. And besides, he said, if there might well be benefit also to this kind of work for many in the West if it persuades them to take meditation seriously. So many people might benefit. Now, again, what's important for my purposes is not the studies themselves. that Benson goes on to carry out. We can talk more about them in the discussion if you want. They did get done. They did get published. They even got published in Nature. So again, you see there's a kind of surprising mainstreaming of a lot of these data. But I'm interested here in not so much in the fact that the studies got done, but in the fact that the Dalai Lama allowed them to be done. That he had opened a door for partially political reasons in 1979 that then others could follow into afterwards. And it matters that this door got opened because the next generation of people to walk through that door opened by the Dalai Lama in 1979 came from that very same counterculture world of Eastern mysticism that Benson and his projects had explicitly repudiated. And key here were these three men. Richie Davidson, who I mentioned before, Danny Goleman, who some of you might know for his work on emotional intelligence. Is he a name that rings a bell to anybody? The folks over here. And John Kabat-Zinn. All of three of these, they knew each other. They'd all been involved mostly in the Harvard-Boston area in the youth counterculture movements of the 1970s when they were graduate students at Harvard and MIT. They encouraged each other's interest in meditation. They'd flirted, if not gotten more deeply involved in TM. I haven't quite gotten to the bottom of how deeply involved with TM they were because they're a little bit reluctant to talk too much about it. But clearly, they were part of that world. And then they grew up. Kabat-Zinn went on to commit his life to teaching meditation and yoga in the context of a outpatient unit in a hospital out at University of Massachusetts in Worcester. Richie Davidson became an academic psychologist. Daniel Goleman became a science journalist. So they may well have thought that they had left their youthful passions behind and had moved on. But then in the early 1990s, they were invited to participate in a meeting that had been organized by a still quite young organization known as the Mind and Life Institute, that I'm now on whose board I now sit. Then the meeting would involve a conversation with the Dalai Lama of Tibet because he's interested in science and he likes to talk to scientists, and around the theme suggested by Danny Goleman of the health benefits of meditation. A number of people came and presented. Goleman would later edit the book that came out of that meeting called Healing Emotions, and it could have all ended at that. But at some point during that meeting, a apparently rather casual conversation ensued that would prove significant. Someone asked, what do we know about the physiology, not just of the kinds of meditation, say, that's being practiced by people at John Kabat-Zinn's outpatient clinic? What do we know about the physiology of advanced meditative practitioners? And predictably, people said, oh, we don't really know anything about this. How could we ever study them? But maybe we could, they said further, because, well, we've got new kinds of technologies now that are more mobile. We could bring things into the field, and we have now potentially a contact. And they went to the Dalai Lama and said, what would you think about our studying the physiology of advanced meditative practitioners here in Dharamsala? Now, a different Dalai Lama in a different political climate, or a different kind of temperament, less interested in science, all sorts of contingent factors, might well have said, no way, this is not what we want, this is not appropriate. But we had the political climate at the time and the Dalai Lama that we had, and he said yes, they could study the monks. So they went up into the hilltops above Dharamsala, India. Dharamsala is the little village where the Dalai Lama has his private home and his government in exile, and there's a whole Tibetan community in exile living in Dharamsala, and there's a very large monastic community of people meditating, practicing in Dharamsala, and practicing, some of them in little huts above the main city. And so a little expedition went off up to the hilltops to talk to the monks who had been identified by the private office as being particularly advanced and therefore potentially good subjects for the study. And here's an important thing to register. It failed. The monks didn't want to have anything to do with it. Even though the Dalai Lama had put all the force of his authority behind it, so all the more surprising. They were suspicious of the project. They didn't see the point of the project. They kept asking about what the benefit, the ethical benefit of this work might be. And most important in some sense, or maybe at least most interesting for our purposes, they said, how could you make any sense of any data that you would get from a study like this if you don't take into account reincarnation? Or the possibility that mind is an immaterial entity not dependent on the brain. You know, so much of what we do takes that as given, and yet you tell us that that's not going to be part of the design. Doesn't make any sense to us. No, thank you. And this left Davidson, now in the early 1990s, and all the others involved in this effort in a kind of a bind. You know, I talk about them as having sort of grown up, but they'd carried into their grown-up, mature years a continuing desire to try to want to mainstream and assert the value of the meditative practices that have been so meaningful to them back in the 1970s. But they were now part of the mainstream. They weren't any longer counterculture youth. So how do you mainstream something like meditation if your subjects are going to insist that you admit the possibility of metaphysical claims that are outside the realm of respectable science, at least as currently practiced? They needed a different way forward, and they found one. It took almost a decade, 8 or 9 years. They found one in this man, Mathieu Ricard, now quite a prominent figure in the current dialogue between Tibetan Buddhism and neuroscience, a Tibetan monk, but French-born, and who, before he became a monk, had actually gotten a PhD in biochemistry at the Pasteur Institute in Paris. So he was no stranger to science. He wasn't afraid of science. He understood how the game of science worked. He was happy to donate his brain to the cause of mainstreaming meditation, or of raising mainstream awareness of meditation. He was also able, in a way, interestingly, that the Dalai Lama hadn't been able to do, to persuade others in the Tibetan monastic community to get involved. And the Dalai Lama continues to be part of the conversation, continues to support and encourage all this, and so it goes on. But it still might not have unfolded the way it had all done. And I keep kind of saying, I'm trying to make a point here about how contingent all these developments were. It still might not have all unfolded the way it did had it not been for one last thing that happened in the period between the original failed expedition to Dharamsala in the early 1990s and the kind of emergence of a apparently robust and viable the partnership between Buddhism and neuroscience at the end of the 90s. It wasn't just about Mathieu Ricard. It was about the fact that the 1990s was not just the decade of the brain. It was also the decade that saw the real efflorescence of America's love affair with Tibet. The Dalai Lama wins the Nobel Prize in 1989. And for some you know about that, he wins the Nobel Prize for his nonviolent efforts to negotiate the Tibetan cause with the Chinese government. And after the winning of the Nobel Prize, he begins traveling much more frequently to the West, including the United States. And as he does, eloquent followers of the Dalai Lama, like particularly, sorry, I've got my slides a little bit, let me just do this man, Robert Thurman, begin to craft a message to the greater public about the relevance of Tibetan Buddhism, not just for Tibetans, but for everyone, as part of a way of activating global concern about the importance of preserving this endangered culture with the incursion and continuing incursion of the Chinese in the country. So what he says for people like Thurman is that Tibetan culture isn't just for Tibetans. It's a global resource for the rest of us, and it's a global resource because it can offer a non-polarizing spiritual alternative to the theistic religions like Christianity that set themselves up in opposition to things like rationality and science. And in saying this, Thurman is picking up on a considerably older trope in our culture that goes back to at least the late 19th century that basically says that science is at war with religion, but by religion it means not all religions, it means Christianity. Going in here you see some kind of traditional sort of reference points to this rather creaky argument, Galileo being condemned by the Catholic Church, and so on. But that Buddhism, also in the 19th century, is different from Christianity in this sense. Buddhism is friendly to science. Buddhism is open-minded. Buddhism is a kind of religion that could provide a wonderful antidote to the kinds of polarizations that even back in the early 90s were beginning to surface between secular culture and fundamentalist Christian cultures. So Thurman makes that argument, and he gives it a new twist that's highly significant then for what happens next. He insists that Buddhism in general, but Tibetan Buddhism, it seems, in particular, isn't only compatible with science. He says it's a kind of science in its own right, and he calls it inner science and contrasts it with Western external or outer science. And he says, you know, we've been investing all this energy into the external exploration of the material world, but how much happier are we? How much better off are we really? Maybe it's time, he says, to pay attention to the findings of the inner science of Tibetan Buddhists, people who explore the mind using techniques of meditation to penetrate into its real depths. And we should do this, he says, because Tibetan Buddhists possess keys to serenity and happiness that we in the West lack. So he says repeatedly things like this: I believe their culture contains an inner science particularly relevant to the difficult time in which we live. My desire is to share some of the profound hope for our future that they have shared with me. Now, he didn't originally direct this idea of Buddhism as inner science explicitly to the neuroscientific community. But you can immediately see how it might be seen as relevant, because if Buddhism is an inner science of the mind, then it might be just what the cognitive sciences and the neurosciences focus as they are on the brain, the external science of the brain. It might be of the mind. It might be just what they need to advance. It might be that each completes the other. There's the inner science of the mind that's practiced by through exploration, through meditation. There's the outer science of the mind that is pursued through studying the brain. Inner, outer, wisdom, data, first person, third person. These become polarizing binary tropes that get used. And it's been profoundly influential on the framing of the phase of the Tibetan Buddhist neuroscience dialogue that we're currently in. You see it, though, being used as early as 1991 in one of the very first dialogues involving the Dalai Lama and brain scientists at Harvard University. So add to this particular framing of the relationship the fact that the Dalai Lama is so personally interested in science for completely unrelated reasons, I think. Again, simply biographically, and you can begin finally to see why we are where we are, why the Dalai Lama ends up being invited to enlighten and inspire groups of neuroscientists at the Society of Neuroscience, but also is invited to inspire and enlighten and guide all sorts of neuroscientists at other meetings, including the one that was mentioned by Bob in the introduction, at which I participated. And there you can see me, actually, there in the middle. This was at MIT in 2004. So where should this all leave us? Well, I kind of have a simple kind of conclusion, but it's taken me a while to arrive at it, so granted to me. I think at the very least with a greater appreciation than we might have had before for just how constructed, just how contingent this current vision that we have in our society is of a partnership between Buddhism and brain science. We are where we are not because there was some kind of inevitable perfect goodness of fit between neuroscience and Tibetan Buddhism, but because a lot of people made non-inevitable choices to build alliances and define relationships in very specific ways and for very specific reasons. And once you begin to appreciate that, you can find an interest in the anomalies, the bits of the story that don't fit. You can make sense of them differently than you might have before. The unsuccessful encounter between the brain scientists and the monks up on the hilltops above Dharamsala. Hard for my colleagues in the Mind Life Institute to really figure out how to think about. Well, it's just kind of, it didn't work. And they kind of leave it at that. Or another anomalous moment that I think I'll just kind of end on because it just seems so apt in terms of my larger argument here. And it concerns where the Dalai Lama himself really might fit into this larger enterprise. Because in the thinking of in the framing that's dominating this vision of partnership, he embodies inner science, ancient wisdom, all the kinds of virtues of the East. But it should also be maybe clear to you from what I've just said, even just in my short brief remarks tonight, that this role of the Dalai Lama as ancient, wise teacher fits, but only partially, that it's probably a lot more appropriate to think about the Dalai Lama as a modernist. Someone who knows that for Tibetan Buddhism to survive in the modern world, both in exile and in Chinese-occupied Tibet, it needs to update its understandings in order to survive. And this is one of the most important further motivations that he has for pushing hard on these encounters with science. He takes, and it isn't like this isn't me just saying this, he says this over and over again, and people don't hear it because it doesn't quite fit the frame. But every once in a while, this bit of his agenda kind of pokes its way into a proceeding and leads to a kind of people being caught up short. And this takes me back to the Society for Neuroscience meeting and the speech that he gave to the 13,000 neuroscientists there. There was one thing about that speech that I didn't tell you, and I want to tell you now. In the course of his remarks, the Dalai Lama suddenly came out with a quite remarkable statement. He'd already affirmed his interest in support for research into the brain bases of meditative practice. And he went on to say that in his view, meditation is nothing really more than a technology for reprogramming the brain in more productive directions. And there might be other technologies that are equally beneficial. And then he said this: if it was possible to become free of negative emotions by a riskless implementation of an electrode without impairing intelligence and the critical mind, I would be the first patient. Now, this feels like what does it feel like? Well, certainly like a pretty modernist suggestion, maybe a kind of materialist suggestion. It's certainly not very easily reconciled with many, if not all, of the romantic understandings that people want to project onto the Dalai Lama in the service of maintaining the particular framing that they're committed to. So I asked some of my colleagues in the Mind and Life Institute later what they thought about that comment. And you know what they said? They said he hadn't meant it. They said it was just a joke. And I didn't say anything, and we left it at that. I don't know if it was a joke or not a joke. He's always smiling. It could have been a joke. But whether it was or it wasn't, it does seem like an appropriately destabilizing moment in the larger scene on which to perhaps end my comments with you this evening. So I'll stop here. Thank you. And I'm happy to have a chat if that's part of the part of the routine.
So thank you so much, Professor Harrington, for a great talk. We have about half an hour available for questions and answers. And we ask you that because we are recording this, that you wait to speak until the microphone is actually in your hand. It does not sound through the house PA system, so you won't hear it over the microphone, over the speakers, and yet it is essential for our recording that you actually have the microphone in your hand before you speak.
And I'll be happy to repeat the questions should it not project adequately to everyone in the room. Well, that's a very dispiriting effect. All right, thank you for coming. Well, in worst case scenarios, you've got to ask a question.
Okay. One of the things that I've often wondered about in terms of Richie Davidson's work with the advanced, what he calls the adepts.
Right.
They're not doing any longitudinal work. They're taking people who are already 20, 30 years into a meditative career.
They know that, yeah.
Yes. And the question is how much of what they're seeing is actually the end result of neuroplasticity and how much is simply self-selection?
Well, again, since I'm not so the question was, is some of this kind of claim within by Richie Davidson and his team and those who are doing this kind of work that meditation has the capacity to rewire your brain in ways that are going to make you happier and healthier and all these other things, is it perhaps completely misreading of the data because they are studying these monks or adepts. They after they've already done 20, 30 years of practice, and it could be, we don't know what they were like 20, 30 years ago. It could be that the reason that they chose the monastic life or have the kind of discipline to practice the way they do is that they already had different kinds of brains, and actually they have no idea. So there can be extraordinary people for a range of different reasons, but the hopeful message is somehow you can translate this into a self-help program for the rest of us may or may not be justified by these data, and I don't think they do know. I think that they started where they started. They're aware that what they need to do is find people who are like 6 or 7 years old going into a monastery, I guess, and follow them for 30 years, or they need to follow them before and after, and maybe they'll find some way to do that. There is a study that Alan Wallace, who is another person involved in a lot of these events and programs and research projects, has done out in California, where they've tracked people who, over the course of a year, people make a commitment to living in a retreat and doing a very kind of intensive form, a commitment to meditative practice over 12 months, and they measure them at 3-month intervals. So that's a kind of a longitudinal study, and I don't know what the results of that will be.
And in my own research with compassion meditation, we've seen very significant changes in cognitive style after only 5 weeks.
Right.
My question is not so much do these techniques have an effect, but rather is the end point that these people who have done 20, 30 years of very complex practices the same end point that an ordinary mortal who did these practices for 20, 30 years would get to, or are they, thinking from a Buddhist, from the whole theological viewpoint, the reason they are able to be in the life that they're in right now is because of karma and is the result of many previous lifetimes of practice. And so from a Buddhist viewpoint,
we don't entertain the reincarnation, the hypothesis in these data, do we, in these studies? Well, I don't know the answer to that, but it does put me in mind of a kind of interesting further tension in all this, in all this work, which is that the researchers tend to be really fascinated by these very advanced meditators, and yet the kind of practical goods that they want to offer to the larger community of consumers of science is one in which you can apply this to yourselves, but they also know that these are not people who are going to be practicing for 20, 30 years, 8 hours a day. About I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, I went to a conference. I showed you the picture of that one. This one, in New York. It was sponsored by some big New York City hospitals, by Tibet House in New York. The Dalai Lama came. There was a lot of talk about advanced meditation, and there was a lot of talk. It was very 70s in a sense. There was a lot of talk about bliss and getting to bliss and like the 9th stage of meditation and being characterized by bliss. And at one point, the Dalai Lama actually said he's actually never experienced that. He's only gotten like stage 3 or 4, and he'd have to talk. So he was very deliberately kind of attempting to kind of deflate them. And but the goal of that conference allegedly was to see how one could bring meditation into the hospital system to help patients, terminally ill patients, children who are frightened, maybe nurses who will work on the front lines. And none of that was relevant to none of all that talk about bliss was the least bit relevant to that laudable goal. And finally, the Dalai Lama kind of calls them on it in this meeting in the nicest possible way, really. He sort of says, like, maybe they should spend less time kind of worrying about bliss and more time thinking about how they can help people be kinder to each other in the hospital setting. And it kind of, for a little while, sort of calmed everyone down. I think these things we're pulled in multiple directions here, and it's interesting to at least notice how that works. Yes.
Yeah, I think that there's a real disconnect here, and that Buddhism and mind-body work and meditation, as the clinicians and the researchers are looking at it, really have nothing to do with each other. I mean, I think it's not Tibetan Buddhism. It's really the advanced practice of meditation, and they're trying to extrapolate something that will work for the Western person.
Yeah, so in case anyone didn't hear that, this woman was your name? I'm sorry, your name is?
Anne.
Anne was basically agreeing that there was a real disconnect between the kind of clinical goals, if I put it, of meditative practice that people like John Kabat-Zinn or even Herbert Benson teaches as a form of stress reduction and very simple forms of meditation that may have a good effect on various kinds of outcome points or symptoms, and all this much more exotic form of meditation that people are so interested in. But
I really couldn't care less about Buddhism. I mean, it's not about Buddhism.
The people who do
the research.
Oh, I don't know about that.
I think they're only. Well, I know some of these people.
Well, I don't. I mean, that's interesting to me, because I think part of the reason they're attracted to the monks is that's where the cultural mileage is. That's where you reconnect to a lot of, if I can use the term Orientalist, kinds of fantasies about the exotic East with gurus who are possessed of capacities and wisdom that we're so all in the benighted West are so hungry for. It is a different kind of project, and so I do think the project with the advanced monks is as much a cultural project as it is a scientific project, and it kind of helps explain the enchanted quality of it. But tell me more about what you know, because you're disagreeing, and I'm interested in that.
Well, I think that people are trying to move an agenda forward, which is a very laudable one, which is trying to mainstream, as you said, meditation and other forms of meditation, yoga, tai chi, etc. And I'm actually involved a little bit in that with a local hospital here. And this gives that a little bit more credibility. This type of thing gives it a lot of credibility. But seeing it up close and on the front lines, as Brian was saying before, I don't think that the Western mind is going to people who meditate occasionally, every other day, once a weekend meditators are going to reach that level. And I'm not sure what they're exactly even looking for at that level. But I think that doing that kind of research advances a good agenda.
It keeps it visible. It keeps it exciting. It brings in funds, potentially.
Exactly.
and all these things. And what
But I don't think that they can make the connection, say, if you do this, this will happen.
what they say is that these people are like the Olympic athletes of the mind. And we're not going to be Olympic athletes, but we can learn, they show us just how far the potential here is, and so they inspire us to see, well, if you can get this far with that kind of practice, maybe I can get, a fraction of that with my practice, but still it's further than I might have believed I could go. It's something, I think that's a rationale that I have heard from some of my friends in this, in this project. Yes?
I've heard of a study. Wasn't there a study, was it in Pennsylvania, that was on the cover of Time magazine or Newsweek about 3 or 4 years ago? Sorry?
Oh, you're talking Andrew Newberg's study of contemplatives, of nuns.
Well, there was one that actually a friend of mine helped with, and I don't know if it was that one, but it was on one of these popular news magazines that Western students were involved in, colleagues of mine, doing not so far out practices, Tibetan tantric practices, but there's lots of Western students now who've been practicing 20 or 30 years, and were they using PET scan? Was that what it was?
SPECT scan.
So
They could take the photo, so they can scan a few minutes after the state was achieved.
now is this Andrew Newberg, you say? That's his work? Because I know he's done...
University of Pennsylvania.
So Andrew Newberg is someone who also wrote a book that got a fair bit of attention some years back called Why God Won't Go Away. And the argument is that we have a kind of neurobiological predisposition to experience certain kinds of mystical states that then lead to the continual reinforcement of a belief that there's a supernatural explanation for these experiences. And he claims to be agnostic as to whether or not that particular interpretation is right or not, but he's interested in the neurophysiology. So I know about that, and I know that he did work on that, interestingly and complicating to a certain extent my kind of argument that this is sort of a love affair with the Eastern brain. He had, I think he had Catholic nuns involved. So and it is a kind of a question for me, a culturally interesting question, like why aren't we as interested in sort of the Trappists or in other kinds of contemplative traditions? Why don't they seem to have the same kind of cultural pizzazz or interest for us? And you can sort of immediately begin to construct some answers, but there's not necessarily a scientific reason not to be as interested in the Trappists as we are in the Tibetans. You could almost say there's no reason not to be as interested in inviting the Pope to the Society of Neuroscience as the Dalai Lama, but there probably is a reason that there's a difference because the Pope doesn't have the same kind of demonstrated interest in outreach. But in terms of the practitioners, I've wondered about that, and Andrew Newberg is one of the people who has done it. But you had a specific question about...
Well, I mean, I think my point was that, I mean, you're saying that the exotic adepts, on the mountaintops, but there are a lot of Western meditators who are trying to weave meditation into their life, and yes. I think this study particularly did research some of them. Western students who've been practicing 20 or 30 years also were showing some kind of results in these scans.
So let me be really clear that I'm not saying that the story I've told here comprises the entire story you would want to tell about the history of meditation and meditation research in the United States. I'm interested in that piece of that larger history that claims that there's a particular benefit to be gained from having a dialogue with Tibetan Buddhism to further that agenda. Independent of that, people who have or are working with more secularized versions of meditation that have been around, as I talked about earlier in my talk, since at least the 1970s, have carried out various kinds of clinical studies and physiological studies, and a bigger history of meditation would need to kind of locate the specific story I wanted to tell inside that larger story. So I don't deny that at all. The question may be how, and this comes back, I think, to your remark, how is the more exotic story that's gotten so much of the media attention influencing that more everyday story, or less the story that's less on, you know, on the radar screen of the media. And you're suggesting that it's probably good, you know, all the boats rise together, that it's good for meditation research in general, that relationships between Davidson's laboratory in Wisconsin and the Dalai Lama, you know, are given such visible press and such generally positive press, as people then take meditation more broadly seriously. I think that's very plausible. I haven't looked so much directly at that. Yeah. Yeah, you're not allowed to speak until you have the.
Could the gravitation towards the Tibetan tradition have anything to do with the, like, the level of sophistication of their method, like to the extent to which they attempt to train their monks and everything? Yeah, I mean, do you see what I'm saying?
No, that's an argument that has been made, that they have such a developed system. They also have a very developed scholarly tradition, you know, around the different kinds of meditative practice, and therefore, you know, if Buddhism is a science of the mind, Tibetan Buddhism, you know, has really, you know, taken it, you know, developed the science to a degree that perhaps the argument that Thurman and others that I've listened to would make, you know, to a degree beyond that of other kinds of Buddhism and other cultural traditions. I'm not particularly interested in deciding if that's really true, or in looking at, you know, Zen or, you know, other forms of Buddhism in other contexts. But that's a good question, and it identifies an argument that's made for singling out Tibetan Buddhism that's out there.
On this this question about regular people and meditation for them, it's important to know that people have paid attention to that. Now, Jean Christella's work, for example, tracks the sorts of effects you can expect as a meditator if you're a raw beginner, if you've been at it for a year, or if you're an adept who's been doing it for a long time, and tracks effects in 6 different dimensions. And so you've got early, middle and late stage effects for each of those, which is directly useful in therapeutic contexts.
Yeah.
So if you need to be working for 20 years before you can expect to control your anger, don't recommend meditation to that person, right? Recommend drugs or something else, right. Jail maybe. but if you can expect to get reduction of stress with simple practices in the first few weeks of meditation, then that would be a very good way to recover from, you know, heart surgery or something like that. So it's not being neglected. In fact, it's quite an active area of research.
So what I'm kind of learning from the conversations that are, you know, going on across the room here is that probably, if you're interested in the history of the clinical, you know, ways in which people have attempted to extend meditative practices into practical clinical settings, you probably don't want to. This isn't really the most relevant piece of the history. Maybe the most so what's interesting about this, if it isn't, you know, to find out what psychotherapists or clinicians should do by way of recommending or not recommending. What is interesting about it, and I think I'm interested in it, again, for what it can teach us as a kind of case study in an effort to show that the neurosciences can have soul. Then the neurosciences don't have to simply kill our souls and turn us, neurologize us bit by bit, but can somehow adopt an attitude of humility, can say, yes, we have as much to learn from some other tradition as they have to learn from us, can attract into their circles universally acknowledged great spiritual leaders who take them seriously, just as he needs the neuroscientists to take Tibetan Buddhism seriously for his own purposes. The fact that he takes them so seriously is a kind of anointment that gives them license to function in the larger neuroscientific community on a slightly different level than, say, Mark Hauser, who's looking for the moral sense in the brain. And in some ways, even Andy Newberg, who may be, quite interested in spiritual matters, but is widely seen as sort of being part of the enterprise that's attempting to kind of neurologize religious experience. And in that sense, again, reduces just to what our brains do.
And thank you so much for the narrative you've told. I appreciate that you said you were focusing just on one part of the neurological study of meditation, but I'm interested in your comments on the issue of whether this narrative is sort of massively transformed by looking at a different crowd. Jean Christella's also hooked up with the TM people, the same crowd with Benson and all of those guys, same era. But there are other people. There's Michael Persinger in Canada, and there's Mario Beauregard, who's worked on nuns, and there's Newberg, who's worked on both nuns and Tibetan monks.
Right.
Using different mechanisms, different tools. These people appear to come from an entirely different set of motivations. They're quite diverse. Persinger's highly anti-religion, and Beauregard's a dualist and thinks that scans can show that the mind's not the same as the body and all of the rest. Don't we have here an entirely competing narrative? I'd love to hear you comment on that.
You've got a book, I think, here, actually.
I think you've got a book.
I think you've got, I mean, you've obviously got, I mean, you're right. I'm not at this point in time, I mean, I've just sort of finished this history of mind-body medicine that was mentioned in the introduction, and one of the strands that I follow in the history of mind-body medicine is what I call, the eastward journey. The idea that we need to turn to the east for methods and techniques that will heal our bodies and soothe our souls. And so I became interested. I mean, I was involved in the Mind and Life Institute independently of putting this book together, but I began increasingly then to kind of wear a double hat in my engagement with my colleagues there in an attempt to see what can I learn from this institute and from these colleagues that will help me make cultural sense of this piece of mind-body medicine. Now, it's possible and even likely that I'm more parochial than I should be because I'm working, I'm following this group of people who I largely know. But I don't think it's a completely arbitrary choice because these are also a lot of people who have been very visible in the media. The folks that you talk about are, in all probability, I'm persuaded, are doing very, very important work, but the New York Times isn't writing articles about them, I guess. Is it? The New York Times is writing articles about them. Then maybe it's a failing of my methodology. Well, tell me about an article in the New York Times, and how are they selling or making sense of this other strand of the history of meditation research?
Sorry, you're asking how these other meditators are...
No, well, you said the New York Times is writing about these other... So tell me, for example, what would be, what was a recent, an article in the last 5 or 10 years that...
Well, Beauregard and O'Leary's book has been reviewed quite widely in a lot of places, and as has Newberg's book.
Yes, of course.
He's been interviewed in 100 places.
No, of course. I mean, Newberg has gotten a lot of visibility, cultural visibility.
And the issue there is not connected to the typical interpretation that emerges out of those discussions isn't related to the East.
Yes, I hear you.
It's barely even related to meditation. It's related to religion, its evolutionary origins, and the meaning of our religious experiences. So it's quite a different slant.
I think that's, I think it's a very appropriate and interesting challenge that kind of I'm implicitly hearing from the group that that if one were to locate this story inside a bigger frame of reference, that made space for these other strands that largely have been moving autonomously, but may be drawing on some of the same, earlier sources, like an early exposure to TM, for example. You'd end up with, I'd be talking quite differently. So I think that needs to be a kind of, for the future.
One tiny little extra. There's some technology aspects of the meditation stuff. Meditate in the right way, you can expect these changes. Well, Persinger uses these EEG studies of the temporal lobe, and a couple of people who've worked with him have created these helmets which are supposed to, in a fair percentage of people, induce the same kind of experience, the religious experience.
I've heard of those. Richard Dawkins put one on.
He did, correct. Yeah,
and
he didn't experience anything.
And felt nothing.
But that gives you a slant on what the interpretive framework is here.
Yeah, I'm actually kind of thinking he's right. I should broaden my sights here. I think this is really interesting.
I'm interested in the religious interpretation of this. I gather that your thesis is that in the early days, there was a great dissatisfaction on the part of students and young faculty members like Richie Davison.
And yourself.
And myself, with Western religion, mainly Judaism. Most of the people that I knew were Jewish, and
the
Christianity.
Jubu phenomena that
Right.
we...
And so the looking for light to dawn in the East was itself a religious move.
Yes.
Could you comment more on that?
Well, I mean, I think you are, in a sense, as able or more able to comment than I, because I was mentioning before we started that you're kind of a native informant of this. You know, that Harvey Cox, who's a theologian over at Harvard Divinity School, wrote about, you know, the kind of the eastward turn. I think he talked about Cambridge, Massachusetts as the Benares of Massachusetts. You know, Cambridge as the Benares, the Charles, I think was the term he used. So I mean, it was, you know, you lived through that, and you know, the Alan Watts writing in this period talked about the fact that, you know, if the theistic religions like Judaism and Christianity, people want experiences. They don't just want ossified dogmas that are going to be spouted at them in congregations. They want to have a direct encounter with the sacred, and if Christianity and Judaism and these religions aren't going to give it to them, they're going to look elsewhere. And he kind of issued a warning. And he also said, and you can't simply marginalize these other religions as mere cults. You know, these are attracting serious, large groups of individuals. The 70s, you know, the 70s ends. I don't know when it exactly ends, but it kind of ends. And I remember when I was in the MacArthur Foundation, which you mentioned, this was this research network of mind-body, researchers interested in researching the mind-body connection. And I was the non-laboratory person there, attempting to be helpful. And we proposed, and I was part of the little team that proposed, a meditation study. And the associate director, I remember saying to me, Anne, it's not the 70s anymore. You know, like, come on. And eventually they did the study, and there's a kind of interesting whole story about that. But meditation research was so 70s by the time we were in, you know, the late 80s or 90s, or when this was. So what is the question? Is the question, you know, the fact that we're interested in a kind of religiously inflected form of meditation, does it tell us something about the state of spiritual discontent in our own time? Is the question about how similar or different is it from the way it worked in the 70s? And this, Anne would like to answer this question.
Well, not to get so specific, but I do think that part of it is that the healthcare system is completely overwhelmed, and that people are using these complementary and alternative types of practices and remedies and modalities to improve their health, because in a lot of cases these days people are no longer getting helped by the Western medical system. So the time has come for this. I mean, there is an energy for this. Patients are frustrated, doctors are frustrated, and it's like, what else can we do to help? So there is really a lot of interest in this.
But is there more than one thing going on? I mean, people turn to these low-cost measures that they can practice themselves. But also, don't people sometimes at least infuse their alternative medical practices with a kind of quasi-spiritual meaning? That, you know, it's not just, I mean, I remember reading, I read articles from the 70s where comparing Herb Benson's relaxation response to a really terrific aspirin. It's, you know, just something you do, and, you know, very practical. Are there not at least some people who are attracted to meditation for health reasons, but also, you know, we improve, it's morally improving?
Well, I will tell you that we're working with a lot of people who've never been exposed to meditation before, ever, and come from low-income communities. This is pretty much outside of their frame of reference, and we're inviting them to do this. and they're having incredible experiences for a lot of different reasons. And we've had demonstrated improvements in depression and of all things, spiritual growth, which was one of 10 measures. So I think people come to it at this point with what they will, but there is a great interest in trying these different things.
I think that's absolutely must be right for your population. I'm just musing as I'm digesting your answer about the 13,000 neuroscientists who showed up to hear the Dalai Lama, and there might be a different explanation that you would want to develop to make sense of. That goes beyond simply the fact that he's a celebrity. Again, the Pope is a celebrity, but I don't know if 13,000 people would have come to hear the Pope at the Society of Neuroscience. I'm interested in trying to do. You think they would? Anyway.
No. I see what you're saying, but
I'm interested in trying to do justice to the question.
He's very charismatic, you know. He's very charismatic.
He's absolutely fantastically charismatic. He's, he's wonderful, but they could all decide to attend his teachings. It's not what's less obvious is why the idea that somehow you're going to have a conversation with him about the neurophysiology of meditation, and that's how you're going to have a kind of spiritual encounter that will make you a better person.
Thank you very much. I'm sure that we'll be able to continue this conversation for some time this evening, but I think we need a moment to let the undergraduates who are here for a course go home.
Oh, I see.
And turn off the microphones and invite you to stay for an informal reception. We have some food in the hallway, and we can stay as long as people want to. Thank you.
Thank you very much.